It was a bitterly cold night in November 1917. The Western Front lay shrouded in darkness and despair. Private James Holloway crouched in a muddy trench near Beaumont Hamel. The incessant roar of artillery had reduced the once green fields to a barren wasteland. Every gust of wind carried with it the stench of decay, fear, and unspoken grief. James's heart pounded against his ribcage as he listened to the distant, thunderous explosions. Amid the chaos of war, an eerie, almost imperceptible sound began to emerge. In the brief lull between barrages, a soft murmur crept along the walls of the trench. It was not the wind or the groan of the collapsing earth. It was a whisper, gentle, sorrowful, and full of secrets. James strained his ears, trying to make sense of the hushed tone. The words were fragmented, barely audible, as if carried by lost souls from a time before man's wars. For several long moments, the only sound was that uncanny susurration echoing off the mud. Then, as if on cue, the murmur grew steadily louder, filling the darkness with its mournful cadence. James's throat tightened with both dread and curiosity. He whispered into the night, "Who's there?" Only silence answered him, deep and unyielding. Yet the whisper returned, softer now, as if reluctant to speak aloud. It uttered a single word, barely more than a sigh, "Remember." A chill, deeper than the winter cold, ran down his spine. The trench, already a claustrophobic tomb of mud and misery, seemed to close in around him. Every droplet of rain and every tremor of the earth took on a sinister new meaning. James recalled the hushed legends passed among the men, tales of comrades lost not only to bullets but to something unearthly. They had spoken in reverent, fearful tones of the "lost battalion," a group of soldiers who vanished in a collapse years before. At that moment, as if echoing their fate, the whisper returned with greater insistence, "Never rest." The phrase reverberated in his mind, mingling with the distant booms of artillery. James clutched his rifle tightly, feeling as though unseen eyes observed his every move. In the flickering, ghostly light of a distant explosion, he thought he caught a glimpse of a pale figure standing at the edge of his vision. The figure moved slowly, almost gliding over the muck, its eyes deep, dark voids filled with infinite sorrow. He blinked in disbelief, and the apparition melted back into the swirling darkness. A heavy, oppressive silence descended, punctuated only by the intermittent clatter of distant warfare. For the remainder of that long, harrowing night, every sound, the creak of wooden supports, the shudder of the earth, the soft sloshing of mud, became a potential omen of the supernatural. Men huddled together in the trench, their faces drawn and eyes hollow with fear. Few dared speak of the whisper that invaded their sleep, but all knew its presence. In murmured voices exchanged over shared rations, they recalled stories of those who had died and yet seemed to linger. Legends told of spirits unable to depart the battlefield, cursed to wander these forsaken passages of earth. James lay awake, long after his comrades had succumbed to fitful sleep. In the darkness, he replayed the whisper over and over, as if trying to decode its message. It was as if the voices of the dead were telling a story, one of betrayal, sacrifice, and a debt unpaid in blood. When the artillery resumed its relentless cadence at the break of dawn, James sensed a profound change in himself. He no longer felt like a solitary soldier fighting an enemy of flesh and blood alone. Somewhere amid the swirling chaos of smoke and shattered earth, the dead were stirring. In that moment, every lump of earth, every crevice in the trench, seemed to pulse with memories of those who had perished. The whisper had evolved into a chorus of disembodied voices, each uttering names lost to time and sacrifice. Edward. Henry. Charles, they intoned softly, as though reciting a litany of forgotten souls. Then, invariably, the final, harrowing refrain followed, "Never rest, till you pay the debt." The phrase hung in the air like a curse, heavy and immutable. Unable to bear the weight of the unknown any longer, James made a decision. Under the cover of the next lull in the barrage, he crept from his cramped shelter into no man's land. The ground was slick with mud and blood, a testament to the relentless, brutal cost of war. Each step was a battle against overwhelming fear and bone-deep exhaustion. The whispering grew louder as he advanced, guiding him toward a collapsed section of the trench wall. There, half buried in the churned earth, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. A skeletal hand, its fingers clawed and desperate, protruded from beneath the soil. James froze in place, his breath catching in his throat. The hand was unmistakably human, a remnant of a life abruptly snuffed out. Tentatively, he knelt and brushed away the thick, wet mud that had concealed it. Beneath the soil, he unearthed a tattered piece of uniform, charred and stained by time and tragedy. The insignia, barely legible in the flickering light, spoke of a soldier long forgotten by the living. In that moment, as a sudden gust of wind whipped through the ruined trench, the silence was shattered by a soft, mournful wail. The sound seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, resonating with centuries of anguish. And then, in a voice so clear it defied the chaos around him, the apparition spoke, "Remember us." James staggered back, his mind reeling from the unearthly encounter. He retreated hastily into the relative safety of his trench, every nerve alight with terror. For the rest of that night, the whispers returned with renewed vigor. They recited the names of fallen soldiers and recounted their tragedies with haunting clarity. Each name carried a story, a sacrifice made in the name of honor, a life extinguished by the cruel hand of fate. And always, the final, dreadful phrase, "Never rest, till you pay the debt." The words became a mantra that tormented James as he lay awake, trapped between life and the cold grip of death. By dawn, the first weak rays of light struggled to pierce the heavy gloom of war. The relentless barrage of artillery resumed, and the trench once again became a cacophony of survival. Yet within James, something had irrevocably changed. The memory of the skeletal hand, the tattered uniform, and those ghostly voices burned into his soul. He realized that in these forsaken trenches, the dead were not at peace. They lingered, trapped by the horrors of war and the debts of honor unpaid. In the hours that followed, as exhaustion and fear warred within him, James vowed to remember every name the voices uttered. He would record their stories, so that those who returned home might honor their sacrifice. For in the darkest depths of conflict, even the dead had a message to deliver. Their whispers were a warning, a plea for recognition and reparation for the atrocities of war. As the day wore on, the battle raged with renewed ferocity. Yet in moments of quiet between the explosions, the ghostly chorus of the lost echoed in the recesses of James's mind. He could not escape the feeling that the trench, with its endless mud and despair, was a mausoleum for souls long since departed. Each breath he took was heavy with the weight of unspoken promises and unfulfilled dues. The whispered names and mournful voices would follow him, a constant reminder of the true cost of human conflict. At last, as the artillery subsided for a brief respite, James sat down against the cold, damp wall of the trench. He closed his eyes, letting the memories of that night etch themselves into his heart. In his solitude, he silently vowed, the dead would not be forgotten. Their whispers would be his guide, their pain his burden, and their memory his eternal duty. For in war, the price of life was measured not just in the blood spilled on the field, but in the souls left to wander, forever yearning for rest. It was a stifling night in the dense jungles of Vietnam in 1969. Sergeant Daniel Carter led his small squad along a narrow, leaf-strewn path. The humid air clung to every soldier, heavy with the scent of decay and moisture. Every breath was a labor, visible in the condensation that fogged their gas masks. In the oppressive darkness, each sound was amplified, a rustle in the undergrowth, a distant drip of water echoing like a heartbeat. Their mission was clear, to penetrate enemy lines and gather vital intelligence from deep within hostile territory. Yet, as they advanced, an unsettling silence descended over the jungle, a silence not entirely of nature's design. Carter's instincts prickled with apprehension as he scanned the dense foliage for any sign of movement. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, from the depths of the jungle, a ghostly mist began to rise. It curled and coiled around the trunks of ancient trees, cloaking the path in an otherworldly shroud. Within that mist, faint shapes started to materialize, figures that seemed more specter than man. Their outlines were blurred and indistinct, as if drawn in charcoal on a rain-swept night. The figures moved slowly, deliberately, as though following a rhythm known only to them. For a moment, time itself appeared to pause as the squad exchanged uneasy glances. Private Nguyen, his voice barely a whisper, murmured, "Sir, are those our brothers?" But the figures did not answer, they simply continued their silent procession. Sergeant Carter's heart hammered in his chest as he ordered the squad to halt. Every soldier gripped his weapon tighter, their eyes straining to pierce the swirling mist. The phantom shapes advanced toward the narrow path, their features growing ever so slightly more defined. Carter's mind raced with the legends he had heard during quieter moments, a lost battalion, doomed to wander the jungle after an ambush so fierce it erased their memory from history. In that haunted moment, the mist parted to reveal one central figure, standing out from the others with an unmistakable air of authority. Its uniform was tattered and stained, the insignia barely visible beneath layers of grime and decay. The apparition's eyes, though void of life, seemed to burn with a sorrowful intensity. Without a sound, it extended a spectral hand, beckoning silently toward a narrow, overgrown trail veiled by thick vines. Carter's pulse quickened as he recognized that the phantom was urging him to follow, a silent command that defied logic yet stirred a deep, unexplainable compulsion within him. He motioned to two of his most trusted soldiers, signaling them to accompany him while the remainder stayed back in cautious formation. Together, they advanced slowly into the mist, each step measured and laden with dread. The jungle around them transformed into an eerie corridor, where the usual sounds of life were replaced by the soft, mournful hum of an unseen choir. The phantom figure led them deeper, its form occasionally flickering like a faulty projection on a rain-soaked screen. Every step forward felt as though they were treading on the thin ice between reality and a realm where lost souls lingered. The path eventually opened into a small clearing, bathed in a pale, spectral light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. In the center of the clearing stood a weathered stone monument, half obscured by creeping vines and moss. The monument's surface was inscribed with faded letters, a dedication to fallen soldiers whose names time had nearly forgotten. As Carter approached the monument, the phantom squad began to coalesce around it, forming a silent, solemn assembly. Their eyes, empty, sorrowful voids, seemed to implore the living to remember their sacrifice. A profound sense of grief and duty overwhelmed the small group as the weight of countless untold stories pressed upon them. Carter's voice, unsteady but resolute, broke the silence, "We will not forget you." In that moment, the ghostly figures did not move or speak, they merely observed in a silent testament to loss and valor. The jungle itself seemed to weep as a gentle rain began to fall, each droplet shimmering like a tear in the dim light. The rain washed over the monument and the spectral soldiers, merging the past with the present in a sacred ritual of remembrance. With every drop, the air filled with whispers, faint, echoing murmurs of names long erased by time and conflict. Carter knelt before the monument and pulled a battered notebook from his vest. His trembling hand opened the notebook to a fresh page, and he began to write the names he could hear on the wind: Lu, Min, Bao. The spectral voices swelled around him, their chorus growing louder with each whispered name, as though affirming the sacrifice of those long gone. The final, resonant refrain echoed through the clearing: "Never rest, till your sacrifice is known." In that haunting moment, the words seared themselves into Carter's soul. He felt the weight of history and the unending duty to honor every fallen life. As the mist began to reclaim the clearing and the spectral figures faded back into the darkness of the jungle, Carter slowly rose to his feet. He signaled to his men that it was time to return to their camp, each step heavy with the burden of what they had witnessed. Back along the narrow path, the memory of the phantom squad lingered like a promise unfulfilled, a promise that every sacrifice must be remembered. Under the oppressive canopy of the Vietnamese night, Sergeant Daniel Carter recorded the encounter in his journal with painstaking detail. Every word was imbued with the sorrow and determination of a man who had witnessed the impossible. He vowed that the lost souls of that haunted clearing would be honored, their stories preserved for future generations. And as the humid darkness swallowed the path once more, the phantom voices, now distant but indelible, whispered a final, solemn plea. Remember, honor, sacrifice. It was the dead of winter in 1951, when the Korean peninsula transformed into a frozen hell. The bitter winds howled across the desolate mountains, carrying with them shards of ice and echoes of despair. Corporal David Kim and his weary unit found themselves entrenched near the chosen reservoir. Every breath they drew crystallized in the frigid air, a visible reminder of the cold that threatened to seep into their bones. The landscape was an endless expanse of white, a barren, merciless wasteland where the sun struggled to penetrate the gloom. Amid the swirling snow and relentless wind, silence fell over the camp like a shroud. Then, from that stillness, came a sound that defied explanation, a soft, deliberate crunch upon the frozen ground. At first, David assumed it was merely the shifting ice under the weight of fatigued soldiers. But as the sound recurred, rhythmic and measured, his heart pounded with uneasy suspicion. Every step he took on the brittle crust of snow resonated like a drumbeat in the oppressive silence. A chill, deeper than the winter cold, crept along his spine as he strained his ears to decipher the origin of those steps. In the distance, barely perceptible through the swirling blizzard, a solitary figure emerged from the white haze. The figure moved with an uncanny grace, its form blurred by the storm yet unmistakably human. David's eyes widened as he watched the apparition, a soldier clad in a tattered, frost-covered uniform, glide silently over the ice. A spectral light seemed to emanate from the figure, as if its very presence defied the biting cold. For a long, agonizing moment, the ghostly soldier paused, its hollow eyes meeting David's in a silent communion of sorrow. Then, without a word, the apparition turned and began a slow, deliberate march toward the heart of the storm. The haunting sight ignited a surge of dread within David, but also an inexplicable compulsion to follow. He signaled to his comrades, but they had retreated to the safety of their makeshift tents, too exhausted and fearful to heed his silent call. Alone, David stepped out into the frigid night, each footfall a defiant challenge against the terror that encroached. The biting wind stung his face as he pursued the spectral figure across the frozen expanse. Every step drew him deeper into a realm where the boundary between the living and the dead grew perilously thin. The landscape around him shimmered under the ghostly glow of a hidden moon, its pale light casting long, distorted shadows on the ice. In that eerie illumination, the snow itself seemed to whisper, echoing the mournful lament of lost souls. Remember, honor, sacrifice, the wind seemed to murmur, as if carrying the voices of those long past. David's heart thundered with the weight of those unspoken words, each syllable a reminder of comrades lost to the ravages of war. As he advanced, the apparition led him to the edge of a vast, frozen lake that stretched like a mirror of despair. The surface of the lake glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, as though lit from beneath by the sorrowful flames of remembrance. David paused at the shoreline, his breath coming in shallow, visible puffs that vanished into the night. Gazing into the crystalline expanse, he saw not only his own reflection but also the countless faces of fallen soldiers, etched into the ice as if carved by time itself. Their eyes, vacant and mournful, seemed to implore him, "Do not forget." Overcome with a mix of grief and determination, David sank to his knees upon the frozen ground. He retrieved a small notebook from his uniform pocket, its pages already smudged with sweat and ink. With trembling fingers, he began to record the spectral voices that whispered on the wind. Boon Suk. Jae-min. Sung-ho, he wrote, each name a fragile link to a life extinguished by the cruelty of war. The final, resonant refrain echoed through the stillness, "Never rest, till your sacrifice is known." That chilling mantra, repeated by the wind and reflected in the icy depths, seared itself into David's memory. As the spectral chorus faded into the night, the apparition slowly receded into the swirling snow, leaving behind a profound silence that spoke of eternal sorrow. David rose unsteadily, his heart heavy yet resolute. He knew that in this frozen wasteland, every fallen soldier's memory was a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Determined to honor their sacrifice, he vowed that their names would never be lost to the relentless march of time. With renewed purpose, he retraced his steps back to the camp, the ghostly voices still echoing in his ears. Each step was a solemn promise to the frozen dead, that their sacrifice would kindle hope among the living. In the days that followed, as the brutal winter raged on and the war waged with unyielding fury, David carried with him the weight of those spectral whispers. The memories of the fallen, etched into the icy landscape, became a silent testament to the price of conflict. And in every quiet moment, as the wind swept over the frozen lake and the snow fell like tears from the heavens, he heard once more their echoing call. Remember, honor, sacrifice. For in the frozen abyss of war, where every heartbeat was a struggle against oblivion, the souls of the fallen demanded eternal remembrance.